Texas needs to be especially careful when flagging non-citizens for removal because, as you may know, back in 2019, the state falsely claimed that 95,000 non-citizens were registered to vote.
We're back with The Big Deal. I'm Errol Louis. Over the last few weeks, we have been looking at ballot questions that will give voters a chance to decide on consequential issues in November. In 8 states, constitutional amendments designed to prevent non-citizens from voting in federal elections will appear on the ballot. That includes Idaho and Iowa, Kentucky, Missouri, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Carolina, and Wisconsin, all of them states that have Republican-led legislatures. Voters in North Dakota and Colorado, Alabama and Louisiana, Florida and Ohio have previously passed amendments which restrict voting only to citizens. The thing about that is, non-citizen voting has been illegal in the United States everywhere since 1996, and election experts say that it rarely takes place. Yet the issue has emerged as an election year talking point for former President Donald Trump.
Our elections are bad, and a lot of these illegal immigrants coming in, they're trying to get them to vote.
Donald Trump is not alone. The Republican Party has raised concerns about the possibility of non-citizens voting in November following an influx of migrants at the southern border over the last few years. In addition to constitutional amendments on state ballots, Republican officials have also launched reviews of voter rolls in an effort to prevent non-citizen voting, including in the state of Texas. Spectrum News reporter Barbara Fox has that story in this report.
Last month, Texas Governor Greg Abbott touted the removal of over 1 million people from the state's voter registration lists.
The vast majority of the removals in Texas are due to death or people who've moved.
That's Quinn Raymond. He's the co-founder of Vote Shield. It's an organization that works to protect U.S. elections. He says while the governor is trying to take the credit, states are required to maintain voter registration lists, adding this is nothing new.
What it comes down to is there's a federal law called the NVRA that requires that every county in Texas, all 254 of them, do a list maintenance on a regular basis.
According to the governor's office, more than 6,500 potential non-citizens have been removed from the voter rolls since 2021. This includes 1,930 people who have a voter history and have been referred for investigation by the Attorney General's office.
The alleged non-citizen removals in the voter records here are just 0.03% of all the voter records in the state. So this is a very small number of records. And Texas needs to be especially careful when flagging non-citizens for removal because, as you may know, back in 2019, the state falsely claimed that 95,000 non-citizens were registered to vote.
Raymond is referring to the effort that took place back in 2019 to find non-citizen voters on voter rolls. According to NPR, Texas state officials questioned the citizenship of about 98,000 voters. NPR reported that a federal judge in Texas ruled that state officials mistakenly concluded that many of those voters were not eligible to cast ballots. Now, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton is urging the Texas Secretary of State to request citizenship data from the Biden administration to identify potential ineligible voters before the 2024 election. In a press release, the governor says illegal voting in Texas will never be tolerated. We will continue to actively safeguard Texans' sacred right to vote while also aggressively protecting our elections from illegal voting. Barbara Fox, Spectrum News.
Joining me now to talk more about non-citizen voting is Jonathan Diaz, the Director of Voting Advocacy and Partnerships at the Campaign Legal Center, a nonprofit organization that advocates for Americans to participate in the democratic process. And Jonathan, critics are calling crackdowns on non-citizen voting really a solution in search of a problem. From your research, is there substantial data or proof that shows that non-citizen voting is a major problem in the United States?
I think you hit the nail on the head. It really isn't. Like you said in the introduction, voting by non-US citizens is already illegal for federal elections all across the country. And we have pretty sophisticated safeguards both at the voter registration stage and in the ballot verification process to make sure that only eligible citizens are voting. So I see this recent push by politicians like Greg Abbott and Ken Paxton as really nothing more than a partisan political narrative aimed at drumming up false concerns about the security of our election system to justify efforts to make voting harder.
Well, yeah, let's talk about the voter registration reviews that are going on in a number of states like Ohio. Ohio identified almost 600 non-citizens who have registered to vote, but that's out of 8 million voters, so it amounts to less than 1/100th of 1%. Is it even worth chasing down such small numbers?
Well, I mean, if you look at the numbers and assume that they got them all exactly right, you're right that it's an incredibly small percentage of voters. But I don't even think that we can make that assumption when states like Ohio and Texas claim that they've identified alleged non-citizens on their rolls. More often than not, in my experience, what they're really doing is identifying naturalized citizens, people who were not US citizens at one point, but then became US citizens and then registered to vote. And they're subjecting those people, who are the only people in America who affirmatively opted in to become US citizens, who took a test, subjecting those people to additional scrutiny, to having them jump through administrative hoops to stay registered. In Texas, in 2019, they identified tens of thousands of naturalized citizens and threatened them not only with removal from the voter rolls, but with criminal prosecution. My organization, Campaign Legal Center, was one of the ones that filed a lawsuit against Texas in response to that activity. And one of my clients, an immigrant from the United Kingdom who was the spouse of a US military member, testified really movingly on the stand about how hurtful it was to have the state come after her after she had become a US citizen, just because they'd done some faulty data matching. And it scares people. It has a chilling effect on voter participation, and it infringes on the constitutional rights of naturalized citizens to participate in our elections.
Okay, so now let's look at another wrinkle in this. Right now, non-citizens are in fact allowed to vote in a handful of local elections. There's a handful of cities and municipalities in 3 states, including Washington, D.C., but they're not allowed to vote in 8 states where constitutional amendments will appear on the ballot. So what exactly is the goal of passing more of these ballot amendments? So is the goal to sort of increase voter turnout? Is that what Donald Trump is trying to do?
Well, I think the goal of these non-citizen voting amendments, there are 2. The first is to play on people's fears. Immigration is a hot button political topic. And so I do think that it's possible that some of these things are being put on the ballot to drive turnout by people who are concerned about this false narrative of non-citizen voting. But the second is to prevent local governments from allowing non-US citizens to participate in local elections. Things like mayor or school board or city council. There are some municipalities across the country that have started to allow non-citizen residents to participate in elections in their towns or cities. But even in those places, non-US citizens are still prohibited from voting in statewide or federal elections. So we're talking about a really small number of towns, and these state legislatures, largely conservative state legislatures, preventing local governments in their states from deciding how to organize their own elections.
Okay, Jonathan Diaz, thanks very much. Thank you for watching our YouTube channel. Let Spectrum News be your resource for balanced, in-depth political coverage, and click the subscribe button right here. You can also download our app or watch us on TV to learn more about the candidates, where they stand on the issues, and more. We'll see you then.